Okay.
Are you walking us through this, or is it a video?
I'm going to walk you through it. Can you hear Talia? I get the sense that maybe you can't.
But we can't hear or see her.
All right. Well, we can fix this because she and I are not socially distant.
Oh, all
We
right.
are married.
Oh.
So
So she's here.
she's very much here.
Okay.
Here, let's do this.
Great. Hang on, please. All right. Can you hear me if I speak into Tim's computer?
Yes,
Yes.
we can hear you.
Excellent. Okay. So it's a little odd because I'm reading from one screen and speaking at another one. So as the Assistant Director for Programming at the Great Barrington Libraries, I'm very happy that you're joining us. And I don't know if you know Tim or not, but I'm going to do a little bio introduction. He's been a conservation leader in our region for over 20 years, working with the Nature Conservancy and the Trust for Public Land before joining the Housatonic Valley Association in 2008. He serves on Connecticut's Natural Heritage, Open Space, and Watershed Land Acquisition Review Board, is a member of the RCP Network Steering Committee and of Senator Chris Murphy's Conservation Advisory Council. And he administers the Connecticut State Committee of the Highlands Coalition and is a past chair of the Connecticut Land Conservation Council. He is a strong advocate for regional conservation partnerships, effective conservation policies at the local, state, and national levels, and the many benefits that land protection provides to our communities. He is currently spearheading a new multi-partner initiative, Follow the Forest, which seeks to protect a north-south climate corridor of connected and protected habitat between the lower Hudson Valley and Canada, and is the topic of his presentation tonight.
The lower Hudson Valley, you said? Or Housatonic Valley?
No, I said lower, or she said lower Hudson, and I'll explain why.
Okay.
Well, thank you, friends, and thank you for taking an hour on a wet and rainy evening to talk about big conservation thoughts. I'm happy to be able to come to you in this way. I'm going to assume that there's more than a little passing interest in the topic, and I will ask if folks would be comfortable muting for the next little while, and then we can have a conversation afterwards. Thanks. So I'll assume that the idea of a wildlife corridor that extends through our region, connecting larger areas to our north and west, is of interest because that is the topic. But I will set it up a little bit by pretending I'm a mountain lion, or rather, I'm going to channel a mountain lion that actually made a trip from the Black Hills of South Dakota to Milford, Connecticut in about 1.5 years of wandering. And we know this sadly because this 3-year-old male mountain lion was struck and killed on the Wilbur Cross Parkway a couple of miles from Long Island Sound. And evidence in its DNA and in tracks that it left show us that it started in South Dakota. It crossed the upper Mississippi. It made its way through the edge of Lake Superior. Somehow it went into Canada. It crossed around the Thousand Islands in the St. Lawrence. It came down to Lake George along the east side of the Adirondacks, and here some more sign was found. it probably went to the Quabbin. It dipped through the Berkshires. It went to Litchfield and was spotted at White Memorial Conservation Center, which is in the heart of Litchfield and Morris. And then it was down in Lower Fairfield County for several days before it came to its unhappy end. That's well over 1,500 miles that wide-ranging cat covered. And as astonishing as that is, and I don't think it's the only time that will happen. This is how large predators have dispersed across the continent. There will be more. But what it did was follow large areas of available habitat and then passed through places where there were all kinds of other impediments: rivers, bridges, houses, culverts, places that you'd be hard pressed to think would be easy for an animal of that size to navigate. This one did. Others have dispersed from the same area to Tennessee. And that's just one story of how a very significant large animal has made use of connected or tenuously connected or in close proximity but not connected habitat to move over great distances. And those of us who live in Western New England are used to looking at parallel ridges of hills, right? The tectonics that go right up the spine of Western Connecticut, Eastern New York, Western Massachusetts into Vermont, and the Berkshire Hills just on the other side of the valley in the east, even broader, pretty much bounded by the Hudson River on one side and the Connecticut River on the other, which are pretty significant barriers for most terrestrial critters unless they trot across a bridge, which some of them will. And so in Talia's introduction, she talked about the lower Hudson Valley being one point on a north-south climate corridor that I'm going to talk to you about. And that's well beyond the Housatonic River and its drainage. Think about where the Appalachian Trail is, and I'll show you a picture shortly that has that in the center. Where it crosses the Hudson at Bear Mountain Bridge is a narrow spot in the highlands, in the large uplands that run in close proximity to Philadelphia and New York and Danbury and on up through our region. And that's how a lot of other animals are moving, north and south. So some might trot across that bridge. Some will have to continue to move up on the west side of the Hudson until they get to the Mohawk Valley and the Adirondacks and hook around the other way. And so we're talking about hundreds of miles of habitat extending all the way to Canada. And where we sit in it is really important because it narrows. Imagine an ice cream cone, and the top of it's the North Woods, right? All of northern Maine and Vermont and New Hampshire and the Adirondacks. And then as it narrows between those two rivers, things get more constrained, and it funnels down to that one point just north of New York City. Lots of animals are using it, and there's some of them moving distances that are comparable to what that mountain lion did. Others are moving smaller, shorter distances, but are going to have to make adjustments with a changing climate. One of them that I've been thinking about recently has been the two populations of flying squirrels, the northern and the southern. You know, unless you've had one in your chimney or have smacked a big dead tree and seen one jump out of a hole, we don't encounter these guys very often. But they have two very distinct habitat preferences. Southern flying squirrel will use deciduous forests, is comfortable with a range of woodlands. Northern flying squirrel needs coniferous forest. It particularly likes spruce and fir, and we do have them in the extreme northwest corner of Connecticut, up on Canaan Mountain and on Mount Riga, and that's about it. And then you have them in the Berkshires. Those guys are going to want to move long term as this century progresses. They're going to want to find more suitable coniferous habitat as the northern hardwoods with hemlocks and the black spruce bogs at our highest elevations become less hospitable to them down here. So interesting questions come up. How far can a flying squirrel jump? And what's a major barrier? Is the Mass Pike a barrier? Is Route 44 that goes from where I'm sitting in North Canaan over to Winchester and Hartford a barrier? How high does it have to jump if it wants to clear that? Does it need to be 60 feet in the air? Or will it come down to the ground and make a run along the road? That's just one species where those questions are still somewhat unclear. But there are implications to how we think about the woods on either side of that road, right? If we're worried about this thunderstorm that's going by right now being a large severe wind event that's going to take power out to our house, well, you won't hear me talk, but that tends to prompt electrical companies to clear wider paths along the sides of roads to keep trees from doing that. But there may be these unintended impacts on wildlife that are now crossing wider areas without cover, or in the case of that flying squirrel, without a nearby tree to land on. It's hard when you talk about what do people need in a changing world and what animals need in a changing world. But the fun of the story I'm sharing with you is we're all part of it, because those mountains in the Berkshires and Taconics that have been the focus of so much excellent land conservation, particularly in Massachusetts, but also here in Northwest Connecticut, still have to connect to each other through habitat linkages. And that's where the roads are, and that's where the farms are, and that's where the towns are, and that's where my backyard is that continues to see bears visiting it, even though we live on a quarter-acre lot in the middle of town, right? So there are some creatures that are going to be less put off by what we put in their way, and there are others that are going to find it challenging. There's a theory that you may have encountered called island diversity. And the idea is that islands end up being less diverse because they're not connected easily to other places. So the number of species you see in an island, they might be unique, right? They might diversify like crazy the way the Galapagos does, but it's not an enormous range of animals that can occupy that space. There's not enough room to spread out. And it's also places that sometimes are refuges for species that are imperiled elsewhere. I was thinking about this yesterday as I was talking to some school children about glaciers. And it occurred to me that this forested landscape that we live in right now, 5,000 years ago, got sort of the last of the tree species that we're used to seeing reestablishing themselves after the end of the glacial period, in the very last ones. And they were moving by nut and seed and creatures that move such things and wind from quite some distance away, including far offshore, because the sea level was lower. And that made me think, how did we get timber rattlesnakes back up here that have to swim the Hudson? But they probably did. And all of our thoughts about where they want to be and how they need to connect. Well, timber rattlesnakes, if they're an isolated population, they lose genetic diversity. And if there's a metapopulation with 2 or 3 or 4 connected dens, they're more resilient. But that still means some snakes have to sort of strike out beyond their normal range to see who's on the other side of the mountain. Just like that mountain lion that took that very long walk from the Black Hills to here. And that got me thinking about what a changing climate means for our region in terms of overall species diversity. All of you here, and I know some of your backgrounds, so you're very familiar with how that wonderful combination of geography and climate and bedrock and history of past and current land use gives expression to the incredible array of species that are found in the calcareous valleys of the Housatonic. And some of them are on the edges of their contiguous ranges, right? Bog turtles are. They're not really north of us in any connected population. They extend south with a big gap after Pennsylvania into North Carolina. But again, those bog turtles outlive their habitat too. And as the fens that they like become beaver ponds or become shrub swamps or become other kinds of forested wetlands, those older turtles have to find the next seepy part of that wetland area. And that can mean they'll walk for miles. And maybe they hit a road. Maybe they hit a deeper patch of water they don't want to go through. So it's happening at all these different scales here. And we have lots of different kinds of habitats, some of which, like a vernal pool, might be important for a very local population of salamanders and wood frogs that are upslope most of the year and under the forest litter most of the year, and very often have to cross a road to get to the wetland on the other side, because we put roads in the path of least resistance, tends to be on the underside of things and before it's too wet. But holding it all together is this forested landscape. So I'm going to stop having you look at me for a moment, and I'm going to quickly take you through this idea called follow the forest, which is not unique to the Housatonic Valley Association, my organization alone, but it's an idea that we got excited about and have been working on with a number of other conservation groups. And it's a pretty simple idea with a very big, scary goal. The simple idea is that those areas of upland forest habitat need to connect to each other. And there are lots of ways you could do that. You could do it through different kinds of management of the forest on the edge, or you could do it through conservation restrictions. You could do it through better design of bridges and culverts where roads are between those forests, but they do need to connect for a lot of species to be able to move as they need to, plants and animals, and as they need to in a changing climate. We've been really good in the conservation community of looking up at the hills and saying, yeah, that's gorgeous, we should save that. And we've been also really good at focusing at rare habitats and saying that's unique, we should save that. But the connections between them are a newer realization for most of us. Not new to all conservation biology, but new to the land trust movement in the last 10 years or so. And it's really clear that even a small area of linked habitat, let's say a stream corridor that runs from one of these upland forests down, crossing under a river and connecting to a wetland, even something like that may be sufficient if we recognize the role that it's playing to make one of those connections. The goal is that from Bear Mountain Bridge down in Westchester County through the lower Hudson Valley and into Northwest Connecticut and up through the Berkshires and the Taconics and over to Lake George to the Adirondacks and up through the Green Mountains to Canada, that those connections are maintained for the long term, and that conservation groups that are active in pieces of that geography and land managers who are managing some of the woodlands in those areas see it as part of a connected whole. And we think about half of it needs to stay long-term in trees, and about half of it needs to connect to the other parts of it. So there's some big numbers associated with that, and I thought I'd show it to you visually. So if you give me a moment to share my screen and pick a good one here. Let's see. Whiteboard. No, don't want that. Let's see. like this. Okay, can you all see something called Follow the Forest? Excellent. So I will not read everything on this for you, but I will call your attention to the idea that if you later have some free time and go to followtheforest.org, you can explore all the functionality in this story map, which takes you a lot of interesting places. But this is the idea. We have a tremendously important global resource in the temperate woodlands of Eastern North America. It is our largest area of forest land. It is the most intact temperate woodland on Earth. Those in China and those in Japan are more fragmented by development than the eastern half of the United States, if you can believe it. And they have all kinds of benefits for us as well as for wildlife. And you know this. You know what it means for drinking water. You know what it means for clean air. You know what it means for soil conservation and for wildlife habitat and for the quiet and restorative recreation that I know I benefit from when I'm able to go out into the land here. And it's special in its own right. And here's some just familiar looking parts of our landscape. Those are, Anne Elizabeth, those are my children back when you first met them. Elias is now 17 and Emily is now 20. So luckily that's a picture of the high point of Connecticut. That's Mount Frizzell from Round Mountain, and it still looks that way, or will in a few months. And there's so as a resource for all of those things and for climate mitigation, for both the sequestering of carbon in growing trees and the storage of it in older trees. Our area has tremendous importance, and our forests have tremendous importance. So there's all those benefits, but then there's this part. Contiguous forest habitat is what holds it together from a wildlife perspective. From terrestrial wildlife, also birds that need very large, some of them very large areas of intact forest for nesting or for stopping along the way. And because most of our headwater streams are rising in our forested uplands, there's an aquatic dimension here as well. And lots of folks, Fisher is an interesting example of an animal that we used to be told needed a lot of contiguous forest for its habitat. And yet it seems to be able to cross more open areas than conventional wisdom used to say. It'll swim, it will go through a backyard as small as mine, but its core habitat is still a larger area of forest. And of course, those fun fellows, the mole salamanders that spend most of their lives underground and emerge in the spring to take advantage of ephemeral pools and wetlands that don't have fish, that won't eat their eggs. So at any scale you care to look at, we're looking at a resource here that is locally important and globally significant. Follow the Forest got its name from someone looking at a map that I showed them, and it was suddenly like a light bulb going off. And they said, oh yes, the animals just follow the forest. And indeed they do, not exclusively. The edge habitats and the field habitats are important for many, but the core that holds it all together are these larger areas of woodland. So I thought I'd take you into that a little bit and show you some of the ways in which we see how that landscape fits together. So let's start with a couple of basic ideas. If you look at the edge of a woodland, the areas that get the most sunlight, the areas that are adjacent to other kinds of land use, there may be quite a lot of interesting habitat value there. There may even be very large trees. What there also tends to be are more non-native invasive species because of the adjacent disturbance that gives them a foothold or a root hold. And it's a very good place for a brood parasite, a bird like a brown-headed cowbird that has a good strategy of throwing out the eggs of warblers and leaving its eggs behind in the nest. Those birds and many of those invasive species have a harder time, although they're not completely absent from, getting established the deeper into the forest you go, into what we call the core. And a way of conceiving of that is to say you might have trees all the way to the edge of the road, but about a football field's width in is where you start to see the buffering effect happen, about 300 feet. After that, you might still have barberry, particularly if it was growing in a field before it became a forest, but the more likely invasives are going to be in the disturbed areas on the edge. There's some very interesting tools for modeling core forest and deciding how big is a big enough patch of habitat. Back when I was with the Nature Conservancy, we were trying to find interior forests of 25,000 acres that didn't have a major road or opening in them. And you find that kind of thing in Vermont. You do not find it here. The biggest areas of largely intact forest, once you've taken out the edge and where everybody's houses are on the inside, the biggest ones are around 15 to 20,000 acres here, and often much smaller. You get down to a certain level, 250 acres, that's about as small as is viable if you had a big storm that would otherwise cut it in half. Think about the storm that went through the Mehewi Cemetery and up through the fairgrounds 20 odd years ago. That had a fairly narrow width, and it was very destructive, and there was loss of life. In a time with even more severe wind events, a small area of forest can be largely obliterated. And there's a good example of that in Cornwall, Connecticut, at a place called Cathedral Pines. That was an old growth stand of white pine, but surrounded by open fields. And so when a tornado touched down there, there was nothing buffering that, and 95% of the big trees were leveled. So you need to have a certain size when you're talking about core forest to have the habitat continue. Here's what a model that UConn came up with suggests as a way of looking at different types of forest. The ones that are in dark green are areas of core forests that are larger than 250 acres. And the areas around them, those things that are called edge, that's that 300-foot buffer in yellow. There are perforations within them where there might be a house that has a buffer around it or another type of developed land. And you can start to see that the landscape, which looks like it has a lot of trees, has less core. In between cores, there can be lots of different things, and wildlife will use it. But think of the core as the stepping stones, and it's often the uplands, it's often the forested slopes that contain those larger intact areas of forest. That's a shot from the Taconics looking out over Kopek, and you can start to see how the forest does continue, and then it gets down into farmland. Here's the other thing that is important to know about our woodlands. They're not in single ownership, and the average size of a woodland property has gotten smaller and smaller, and the number of owners has gotten greater and greater. And that's great if you can't afford a 500-acre retreat and you can buy a 30 or 40-acre woodland. That's wonderful. But your woods probably are within a landscape where it extends beyond your property to more forest land. And so when people are thinking about managing their woodlands, they're usually thinking about what can I do with my property? And the way we're trying to turn that conversation around is to say, what is your property doing in the context of this woodland? What's its role? How does it fit into these larger cores? What animals are using it? What's unique both about your property and the part it plays in that larger forested wildlife corridor? And it's not necessarily what people are used to asking when they're saying, what can I do with my land? But it's important for state agencies and for water companies and for your municipalities and for land trusts as well, because it's the landscape that tells the bigger story. So that's Follow the Forest right there. That area that is highlighted in green represents interior or core forest lands greater than 250 acres in size. And the line that's running through the middle of it's the Appalachian Trail. And down here, where my cursor is now, that's the Bear Mountain Bridge. And right here is Mount Washington. And up here is Hancock. And you can tell that once you hit the Green Mountain National Forest, you're looking at larger areas of forest cover. But it's basically bounded in this image by those two rivers, by the Connecticut River to the east and by the Hudson on the west. So how much of this is necessary for that connected forested landscape to function in all the ways we've described, including as a climate corridor? If you work for Harvard Forest and you're part of their wildlands and woodlands effort, they have a vision of 70% of New England's woodlands permanently conserved, I believe by 2060. That's a goal that I don't think we're going to meet, but it's an ambitious idea. They also have a vision for, I think, 7% of New England protected as agricultural lands. But that's the scale of what they can imagine, because of all of the significance of what we currently have. Connecticut's about 59% forested right now. Massachusetts more than that. And both states have seen a decline in overall forest cover over the last 30 or 40 years. Not dramatic necessarily, but more fragmentation, more breaking up of the larger forest areas into smaller ones. That's the Housatonic watershed. That's that in blue. And what just happened behind it is all of those areas of core forest I was describing to you earlier have been classified one of two ways. If they're more than half conservation land, if they're a state forest, or if they're owned by a land trust, or if there's a conservation restriction or an easement within that entire forest block, then they show up as green. And if they're below that, they show up in that orange color. And we can actually zoom in a little bit here and query them. I'm going to see if I can do that quickly for you. So here's the size of the core forest on Mount Washington. And that's one of the biggest ones. And you sort of ignore one of the roads that goes into the Mount Raga portion of Connecticut in order to create that core, because it's got a closed canopy. But for sake of connected habitat, and it's closed half the year, it works. So that area is almost 27,000 acres in size. And over 72% is protected. So that's pretty amazing. And if you live in Mount Washington, as I remember when I used to work there with the Nature Conservancy, that comes with pluses and minuses for the community too, in terms of sort of control of their own destiny. But look what's around it. All around it are smaller areas of core forest that are not conserved to that level, and that wildlife pass through. And also where quite a lot of streams, including Chenab Brook and Carner Brook, have their headwaters. So we were used to thinking about those aquatic connections, and now thinking about the terrestrial ones, it's a very different idea. here's some of the folk who are definitely using the forested landscape and the linkages that we have in our area right now. Moose routinely make it to Long Island Sound, which is amazing, and often are traveling higher up in the mountains than we're used to thinking. I seem to have frozen now. I'm not sure if you can hear me. There we go. Lots of bears, increasing at something like 10% a year, which is an astonishing number. The numbers in Northwest Connecticut have grown even a little faster than that. And again, a bear will travel over a barrier like this road. It will definitely go over my backyard fence. But they also follow more predictable paths through the landscape. There are places where you're far more likely to see them moving, often because the terrain funnels them that way. So they have lots of options for moving across the landscape, but they tend to concentrate in some areas more than others. Here's our flying squirrel friend. That's the northern one, the one that wants to go further north than it currently is in Connecticut. So here we are again looking at that forested landscape. And there's some interesting science behind how this thing works. Some of you are familiar with the Nature Conservancy's Staying Connected work or Berkshire Wildlife Linkages work. This is an outgrowth of some of that thinking, but it's also operationalized to be a blueprint for conserving land and restoring wildlife connections, not just for identifying where some of those places are, but actually saving them. And so we've benefited from being involved in those partnerships and then have taken it to the next level. The way that TNC thinks about this landscape, it looks like this. And they ask their computer models to say, given these constraints, how easy is it to move from one type of land cover to another across this landscape? So they might say the Housatonic River is a moderate barrier to that, and the Hudson is a rather large one. They might say that a rural road is one sort of barrier and the Massachusetts Turnpike is another one. And when we look at an image like this that's showing different kinds of ways of flowing, if you're wildlife, from one pixel to another across this landscape, the blue areas are constrained, and the greener areas, it's more diffuse and there are more options for animals to move. Well, pretty logically, that's because the green areas are huge areas of forested upland. And the blue areas match up very well with where the core forests are that follow the Taconics, that follow the Berkshires, that go through the Litchfield Hills. There are a few areas on this image that are lowland forest as well, but it's a very close match. You can also look at it in terms of how those places are connected. So all of those ovals that are drawn there, and I will tell you they were not drawn by a computer, they were drawn by a bunch of scientists and people like me thinking hard about where roadkill data and terrain and nearby edge habitat and culverts and a lot of other things came together to suggest these are the places where probably wildlife need to pass in order to get from those areas of upland forest. And so those are places to look with great specificity to say, what's the function of the 6 properties along the north side of this road next to that forest? Which ones are most likely to be sustaining that wildlife linkage? Because we can talk about saving big areas of forest land, but I think particularly in the Berkshires, it's the connections that are needing to be the focus. As you saw from the Mount Washington, Mount Riga example, there's been a lot of land protection in the uplands, but the linkages between them have not had that degree of attention because we've only recently started to recognize their significance. Here's what happens within the Housatonic watershed, where we looked at clusters of those and said, okay, some of those cores, like over here in Amenia and Dover, New York, the cores seem to be somewhat separate from this area of forest in Kent and Sharon, but they are probably how animals moving along the west side of Route 22 in the Harlem Valley are making their way to Wassaic, just like the train does, and then finding their way over into Indian Mountain, Mount Riga, Sheffield. And so the edge of this funnel of habitat becomes really important. So we wanted to look in those areas that are outlined in red that show clusters of cores and connections to see where the most significant places were to try to keep as forest and functioning in this wildlife corridor. So I'm going to show you two examples of that and what that looks like if your job, like mine, is how to find important places to conserve and save. Here's one in the Harlem Valley, over on Route 22, between Dover and Wingdale in New York. So anyone who's ever gone down on the train has passed the old psychiatric Wassaic Center and then into the Great Swamp. This is the area we're looking at. Actually, we're looking just above it. And what you can see in green on either side are two parallel ridges that are part of the Harlem Valley there. The one to the east is flush with Connecticut. It's called, not very imaginatively, East Mountain. It runs from Sherman and Kent up into Sharon. And the one on the west is called West Mountain, and it runs from Route 84, where it cuts over from Newburgh, all the way up to Route 44 in Amenia, with one or two gaps in between. And what's in the middle is a lot of stuff. It's the Great Swamp, which is a really interesting wetland. It's Metro North. It's gravel mines. It's farms. It's dense development. And unfortunately, in this spot right here, which seemed to be the best opportunity for wildlife to move east-west across this area, that's where Cricket Valley Natural Gas Plant has been built. And when we were looking at it from a water quality point of view, that plan for that plant was willing to address all of our concerns about water quality, but we hadn't had this lens until afterwards. And unfortunately, there are a lot fewer opportunities for a bobcat or a red fox or indeed a turtle to go across the 2 or 3 miles here without some significant constraints along the way. So we had to look a little more creatively at where those possibilities might be. So going north a little bit, and I mean just a few miles, here's Dover Plains, here's Rattlesnake Hill, Wassaic is up in there. If you keep going along this valley, you end up in Sharon, Connecticut. It turns out that those areas in blue that you see here and these little cores, that's stream corridors and a couple of fields and one piece of protected land and about a 3-mile, very tenuous linkage between everything on the west side and this large forest over here. And there's a lot less protected land in that part of the Harlem Valley in the uplands than there is in the farmland, because Dutchess Land Conservancy and other really great conservation partners have done a terrific job working with farmers. And we hadn't really thought about what to do with forests and connections until recently. The realization that this area right here is probably one of the few good opportunities for wildlife to move out of New York and into Connecticut down here is kind of shocking to us. And it means that there's some restoration work to do. It means there's some very creative work to do with landowners who are farmers. And it means that there's there needs to be different ways of thinking about land protection than what we had done before. And we need to do more research to see who's using it. This is what the model says. We need to go and see what creatures are actually trying to make that connection. Here's another one. So there's the Massachusetts line. Here's Canaan, where Talia and I live. This is Canaan Mountain, this big one here. And that's one of the largest areas of intact forest in Northwest Connecticut. Here's Route 44 that's going over to Norfolk and down to Winstead. Here's Route 7 going up to Ashley Falls and Sheffield, just to orient yourselves. And this area here is what I wanted to show you. Canaan Mountain has a lot of land protection on it. It's got Great Mountain Forest. It's got state land for the Housatonic State Forest. It has former water company land that was part of a big deal done 17 or 18 years ago that created Centennial State Forest on what used to be Bridgeport Hydraulics lands. A lot of protected land on Canaan Mountain. And some protected lands over here too on Haystack Mountain. And in between is the Blackberry River and Route 44. So let's zoom in on that a little bit. Now you're seeing parcels of protected land. This one here, which we just helped the state conserve in Connecticut 3 years ago, that pretty much brought permanent protection to the edge of the Blackberry River and to Route 44 from Great Mountain Forest. And this is over at Haystack Mountain. But in between, steep slopes, fast little stream, bunch of houses, and the sewage treatment plant for Norfolk, Connecticut. That's what's in here. And over here, the largest dairy farms in Western Connecticut. 1,100 cows here. So there's a very constrained area somewhere in here that represents the best opportunity for wildlife to move from this huge area of habitat to these other areas of habitat on their way up to the Berkshires. And so we had to look at that even more creatively. Here are all the parcels. We spent time on that road looking at how much edge forest there was, looking at how steep the north slope was. Lots of things we're not going to climb a 10-foot high stone abutment. Hoping that maybe there was a connection here, but it turns out it's here. It's this area that actually offers the best opportunity. And we had just helped the state save what was next to it. So from a land protection perspective, talking to this landowner turned out to be a really good idea, and that landowner was interested in conserving their forest. And so it's not a lot of acreage, but it's in a key place. It's in a key place, and if it keeps that connection together, and it's not just a north-south connection, there are species that are going to want to move this way. That's going to be one of those really important places for that to happen. It's not just HVA working on this idea or the Nature Conservancy doing modeling, it's a bunch of folks. Because the Appalachian Trail runs through this landscape and their Wild East effort identifies just how extraordinary it is, not just on the trail, but for 100 miles on either side of it from an ecological and a cultural perspective. They're excited about what Follow the Forest represents. There are several large partnerships of land trusts and other conservation groups that intersect with this landscape. The one I've had the privilege to lead since 2008 is called the Litchfield Hills Greenprint Collaborative that focuses in 29 towns in Northwest Connecticut, but there's the Berkshire Taconic Regional Conservation Partnership that runs right up Taconics from Kent, Connecticut, and from over where that Cricket Valley gas plant is in Dover, all the way to Rutland, Vermont, and includes many Berkshire organizations that are familiar to you all, as well as Columbia County, Dutchess County, and others. And the Staying Connected initiative, that's the macro idea of wildlife habitat linkages throughout not just this landscape, but others that the Nature Conservancy and others have been promoting. So what we're doing that's new is recognizing that the forests are what hold it together, and that targeted land protection and engagement with landowners is what's going to allow the wildlife linkages to persist over time, and a big goal for trying to make that happen. Here are the areas where those partners intersect, and this is what kind of excites us. We all defined our areas of interest differently, but they all hit that core forest corridor, from the Appalachian Trail to the Berkshire Taconic one to others. And because those partnerships evolved organically and everybody set some priorities together, we hadn't had a chance until this information came along to see how much we actually shared in something even bigger. The same way that that landowner that I hypothetically talked about, who owns 40 acres of a forest, might not understand how it fits into a larger woodland. This has been eye-opening for many of us, and has many of us thinking about different ways of achieving that vision, because clearly we're not going to take 500,000 acres off the tax rolls and prevent development on all of it. But there are ways to think about how to sustain that wildlife corridor and keep it forested, that we're all really excited about, that do include land protection, particularly targeted. So that's a lot of stuff. And if it interests you and you want to play around on this some more, I do urge you to visit followtheforest.org. In addition to this story map that I've just walked you through, there's also a map viewer there where you can turn on a number of different data layers and explore how the habitat and the communities in this area intersect. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here, and if folk have questions or thoughts, or if I've been talking about things that are puzzling and strange and you want to dig into it, I'm happy to answer questions.
Wait, are you there?
Yeah, whoops. You'll have to unmute yourself again, Anne Elizabeth, and I'll hear you. Yeah.
So on the map, I didn't see the Quabbin and the Harvard Forest area, or did I just miss seeing that?
No, you didn't,
Because
and that's
isn't that
because
part of
it is on the east side of the Connecticut River. So
right,
here's
of course.
the cool part of it, though. They've got another story just like this in eastern Massachusetts and eastern Connecticut. It starts in Rhode Island. It goes up through central Massachusetts, through Harvard Forest, through the
Blackstone,
White
right?
Mountains, and it eventually ends up in the Maritimes of Canada. And
Oh, yeah.
one of those Nature Conservancy images earlier that was in blue sort of showed that. Two legs of it going like that. There's actually three, because something's going on in the Catskills too, that connects all the way down to the central Appalachians, and makes its way up through Pennsylvania and up through central New York and through the Catskills on the west side of the Hudson, into the Mohawk Valley to Tug Hill Plateau and the Adirondacks. And that's the even longer one. If you're thinking about species that are in South Carolina that someday are going to find the Berkshires more hospitable, that's the more logical route than coming up Route 95 and trotting over the George Washington Bridge. That's probably not how they're going to do it. But they will do a hook around and come down. So the bottom of Lake George is a really important, the lower part of it, a really important connection between the Mohawk Valley and the Adirondacks and the Taconics and the Greens, and by extension, the Berkshires and southern New England. Again, there's not a lot of mammals that are going to swim the Hudson, but when you get up there, there are ways around. And clearly, they're not just coming from the south. The Black Hills are another example. But because I work for a watershed organization that encompasses about 1/5 of the geography I was sharing with you today, that's as far as I've been able to imagine wrapping our arms around without more partners. But we are very excited to pitch this idea to folks east of the Connecticut and west of the Hudson too, because it all fits together. And together, those three north-south forested climate corridors hold it all together for the eastern half of the United States and its deciduous forests.
I just have one more comment. you said in the beginning that the Northeast or New England has the largest.
Eastern deciduous forests of North America. So not just New England. Everything east of the Mississippi and up into Canada, that huge forest biome is the most intact and largest temperate deciduous forest area on Earth.
That's amazing. I never would have thought that.
It's bigger in forested area than the forests of Western North America too, which are not deciduous, but which are part of the Rockies and other parts of the Pacific Northwest. And this is actually a bigger area. And yes, it's got roads and houses and people all over the place, and it is still more intact than the other large temperate deciduous biomes in Asia and Japan.
Unbelievable.
Jim, I see you smiling. I'm wondering if you wanted to share a thought or poke holes in my theory or any of that. And
well, I certainly don't want to poke holes in any of your theories. I think that it all rings true. For those that don't know me, I am a consulting forester. I also have a 330-acre tree farm in Sheffield and a little bit in New Marlborough. It is also all conserved from future development through the Massachusetts Agricultural Preservation Restriction Program. I am also on the board of directors of the Mass Forest Alliance. It is a member active group that thinks that it's important that we have working landscapes in forest habitat. And we are constantly at battle to make sure that we do have that right to have a working landscape and recognize the benefits of that are creating wildlife corridors and all.
No, that's terrific. I have a question for you as a person who makes his living as a professional manager of forests. How much of an ask is it to say, hey, consulting forester, when you're doing a cutting plan or when you're making a suggestion to a landowner, can you share with them the context of their property in the larger forest? Can you give them a sense of what it's part of so that the management unit actually is informed by that larger habitat consideration? How difficult is that for folks to do, and what resources would be helpful?
It's generally not difficult to show them that they are part of a larger habitat. We currently have a management program in Massachusetts called Foresters for the Birds.
Yes.
Where in that program, we're automatically looking at the surrounding 2,500 acres, even if it's a 10-acre parcel, and how that habitat, the percent forest, the percent open, the percent developed, and all that. So that does give them a sense, and they often have a sense of what their neighbors are like. Their individual goals and objectives are not usually focused on the larger habitat zone, but as I view it anyhow, as long as it stays a forest,
right,
it creates the mosaic of early successional for those species, mid-successional or near climax in some cases, wetlands, dry spots. That mosaic is out there. And we are currently looking at a healthy soils action plan for Massachusetts. And they said that the threat to the soils, the only significant one that you could follow on the track was conversion of forests to other uses. And if we can keep forests as forests, we're going to be ahead of that game all the time.
I agree with you. And of course, the fun of it is that there's currently lots of places where you can do multiple things. You can have older growth trees, you can have multiple age class forests, you can have places where you're managing for certain younger forest characteristics. You can't have them all in the same spot. And so often it's a question of knowing sort of what's, at least from my perspective, what is going to provide the healthiest and most resilient landscape in aggregate, right? So that, as you say, with more storms, with changing stressors, with the next tree disease, all of those things, we still have an intact forested landscape that's big enough so that whatever losses it's going to absorb, it'll mitigate against the worst ones. And I go back to those stand replacing storms that took out a patch of forest that just wasn't big enough to still be there when that storm was finished. Or I think about what's happening to ash trees now. And there's a species that is between 5 and 15% of many of our forest communities. And that'll open up other questions, right? Do you intervene and harvest a valuable species and salvage it? Or do you say, you know, any resilience that any tree is ever going to have, it needs a chance to figure it out. Well, this particular one is a killer. But it makes me think of the chestnuts, so.
Right. So speaking of chestnut, just driving down from my house, I see that on my property, I will have Native American chestnut seeds this year again.
Wonderful.
And because of the heavy cutting that I did, creating early successional habitat, the chestnuts grew fast enough that they actually bloomed and bared a crop for 3 years. And now I'll have another one. And Mass Wildlife has identified on my property the first time in Sheffield, the New England cottontail, which hadn't been found in Sheffield before, but they took pellets, rabbit pellets, and DNA'd, and they said, nope, the New England cottontail is on Jim's property.
Sure.
It is that mix. And I also just completed a year ago an online class for adaptive forestry with climate change. And I am blessed by having the right kind of gentle slopes, soils, and terrain that can handle aggressive cutting, allowing a mix of species to come in and not be faced with the adverse effects of some sites such as spruce fir forest and that are going to just get wiped out. I'm already oak. I've already got a lot of white oak. I've already got tulip. So I've got a mix of species that will adapt well as it gets hot. And I've got the terrain so that I can grade so that when these severe storms come, I'm prepared and minimize their adverse effects.
You are lucky. That's a good combination. Other thoughts or questions from any of you? Virginia, if you can unmute yourself, I'll happily answer your question.
I'm sorry.
There you go. Perfect.
Zoom is still not totally my friend.
I don't think it's friends to everybody totally.
I'm one of those summer people, but I'm here 7 months out of the year and the rest in the city, not down south. And we've had our home in Alford for 63 years and have seen enormous changes. And I just wanted to share a tiny bit of that with you because this is also wonderfully resonating for me when I'm hearing. So sorry I got on late. But my family is on Route 71 in Alford, and less than an acre of land because we were the barn to a long-standing, well over 100-year farm family and meatpacking family. They're Randys, they go way, way back. And I'm old enough to remember seeing all the way up the hill to the corn, the cows, the mosquitoes, etc. And what I have seen over the years is such despoilation, I think is the word. Initially, there was too much money. And so what had been a country road with lots of trees on it, they sold their souls to the devil in order to have a superhighway, which is what became Route 71. And I have still the newspaper articles from 1982 that dissert about the fact that what was explained to us is you don't need the trees anymore because we don't have horses to hitch them up to.
Hmm. Hmm.
Is the rationale.
Hmm.
And I try to teach my very adult grandchildren what that meant. In addition, we had hoped to take a tiny bit of land to the right of us, owned by someone who was a large landowner at the time. It would have been yet another acre at most. And when it didn't happen for family reasons, a road was built up, several houses went up on the hill, and the water supply was diminished,
Mhm.
et cetera, with up Crooked Hill, again, McMansions where nobody's living, or maybe almost nobody. Conversely, one of my mentors lived in Great Barrington and bequeathed her property to the Conservancy, and it's called the Pfeiffer Arboretum.
Mhm.
That's another way of preserving the natural forest and the wetlands that happen to be part of that property. And she felt this is the best way to give to the future. And I know Ron Yapel well, who I'm sure you
Sure.
know. He's a dear friend. So anyway, I just wanted to give you a contrast, and I know about the Green Agers and support them, and I think we've come a long way, baby.
Well, we have, and thank you for giving us that context.
That's
Something no, it's critical. There's more than 100 years of conservation fights won and battles still to win, and admirable people doing amazing things. Some of them on this call that have really made have made a tremendous difference, and added to that legacy. If you look up at any of those hillsides that don't have houses on them, the reason October Mountain is protected, June Mountain is protected, lots of greylock is, and there are reasons why big chunks of Sheffield, including a lot of wetlands in Sheffield, are conserved. And it was not just huge organizations swooping in to save the day. It was local people identifying that there were things that were important that were going to go by the wayside. I like to remind people that I'm in a business that is about love, loss, and hope, right? Love, because conservation, we don't save what we don't love. Loss, because there have been losses and there will be losses, and what we're facing now with our warming world is beyond imagining sometimes. And hope, because there is hope.
Yes.
There's hope because of people who think about and care about their own property, and there are people who are finding new ways to allow the things and the species that share this land with us to persist over time. What I've shared with you is one larger scale way of thinking about it, but it gets very local, right? So I can guarantee you that even with Route 71 in Alford, there are ways that animals come off of Harvey Mountain and find their way through. Right?
More turkeys, more bears, more all kinds of guys. Yeah, than I've had in a long time.
So Tim.
Yeah.
That bear that's been coming and eating my peaches, are you responsible for that?
My goodness. Probably because Connecticut doesn't have a hunting season, so they'll come back to my house afterwards. No, honestly, that resurgent forest is responsible, right? As well as the turkeys, as well as the much healthier bobcat population, as well as the resident slightly wolf, slightly dog DNA eastern coyote. You know, that wildlife resurgence story, it started when my mother was young and saw her first cardinal up here, right? Because those were a mid-Atlantic bird, and that was in the late 40s. And I saw my first bluebird up here in 1981, and Rachel Carson had a little something to do with why I got to see that bluebird, right? Over decades, a changing environment has allowed some remarkable resurgence of wildlife, sometimes behaving in ways they didn't before. The bear that there are a lot of bears in our neighborhood, but the one that came by and hit the dumpster 2 houses down from us last week did not care that I was out back banging on a sap pail. It did not blink. It did not twitch an ear. It went for another bag. So no, I'm doing everything I can, Jim, to encourage the bear to go back to the woods, but I make light of it. I'm a little concerned at how habituated they are,
Yes.
because there's a tragedy in that bear's future, and hopefully not in one of our futures too. And it's very predictable. So finding ways to live maybe a little more uncomfortably close to some wildlife while not making the situation so wonderful for them that they're in our kitchens with us is part of the art. Yeah.
I think that's one of the things that we as humans in New England have lost.
Mm.
That when you look back in time and you think about the 1800s, even up until probably 65 or so,
Mm-hmm.
there were so many small farms, people living essentially on the land,
Mm-hmm.
and they were connected with the land. And now too much of it is not connected. People don't know how a bear will act or how a deer will come to something. And they haven't, I mean, again, being a forester, I feel so blessed. I've been out in the woods and haven't had a fisher climb a tree about 40 feet from me to look at me like, what are you doing here?
Mm-hmm.
So, but we've lost something when we have lost that connection with the rhythm of weather and animals and soil and the terrain and land and how a storm comes over a mountain. It's just, those are miracles that are out there. And the more we can recognize them, the better off we'll be.
Music to my heart, Jim. I completely agree. I have, since 2008, written a bi-weekly piece for the Lakeville Journal that's entirely about that. And I think that piece is finally winding down. I've run out of ways of saying the same thing each year, but I keep seeing new wonders. And maybe that's the silver lining in this cooped up pandemic world of ours right now. A lot of us have been spending more time in the home place, and if you open your eyes, the home place has a lot to tell you. I have 8 chickens now. They're telling me a lot things I did not know about chickens at all, about their own personalities, what they can learn, who they don't like in the yard. It was a good way for me to get through a siege year, was to be a small scale, very tender-hearted chicken farmer. But there's all those timed events, Jim. That comment you can see maybe for another day, or when the salamanders emerge in the spring, or any of those things that if you're open to them, the wonder is still there. That's why I do what I do, and it does make living here very meaningful to me.
I love the story of the mountain lion. I've told it myself several times. And I also like pointing out things like, depending upon what state you live in, they will tell you whether or not they have mountain lions there. And each one, for its own reasons, has its own description of what it is. And my current understanding that in Massachusetts, they're only transient, there's no population resident, and if there is, it's only illegal animals that have escaped from illegal private collections.
So that was definitely the line for a good 20 years. It got a little bit less strident when the species was delisted federally, so that the same as your New England cottontail, right? Had that been listed as a federally threatened species, land management questions would be looked at in a very different way. A mountain lion uses 50,000 acres minimum. So there were some politically astute reasons to say, maybe it isn't so. But there are the examples, I don't think they're wrong, about the wide-ranging lone individuals are using the network of habitats that exist. Whether they become a resident reproducing population today or 5 years from now, eventually they will. And there's plenty of suitable habitat. It's about enough fertile animals making it here from where they actually live, which is quite far away. And then we'll be having a different conversation about living with wildlife. But even 10 years ago, Connecticut used to say that the bears here were Massachusetts bears. And Elizabeth, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
I'm
It was
going to
wonderful.
wrap it up as well. I appreciate you all spending time with us. I'll turn it back to Talia to sign us off.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for being us. And, for people who missed the beginning of this, it will be up on the library website in the Niche Academy section of the digital media. You can always call the library. If you can't find it, you can call and one of us will let you know how to access it.
I really
Thank
want
you.
Thank you very much, everybody. Have a great night.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Good night.
You're welcome.